The mainstream media in the United States has really mispresented this entire, what they want to call a civil war. It's actually been a proxy war for 6.5 cruel years, where we see the United States and their protectorates, Saudi Arabia and Israel, really going against the sovereignty of the Syrian state, against Iran, against Hezbollah, against anyone who dares to stand up to imperialism in the region. So this is indeed a victory for the Syrian people. It's really a victory for all of humanity that ISIS is at last defeated, is on the run, is on the defensive. But U.S. intelligence in coordination with Saudi intelligence, this is really where a lot of the support for these jihadis, for these terrorist forces has come from, not just in Syria, but also in Libya. They've kept ISIS on a short leash, at one moment condemning them and at another moment sponsoring them, just as they did in Afghanistan with the Mujahideen, and as they've done really throughout the world when it's to their benefit and to the benefit of empire.
Well, Michael Lane, now this is a major defeat for also those who supported the terrorists. Can you name the countries or entities that you think was mostly behind these terrorist groups like Daesh, like al-Nusra, because we know that they just did not appear out of thin air?
Well, what you want me to say, I certainly will. There are elements in the Gulf, allies of the United States, that were certainly willing to provide financing and weapons to the rebels in the Syrian civil war in an effort to topple the regime under the theory that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there were a multitude of different organizations that were combined in the fight against President Assad. Some of them, as you point out, were the Islamic State and the al-Nusra Front. Those were clearly just flat-out terrorist organizations that were being used by some allies of the United States to prosecute that war. That part of it appears to be over. I'm very happy to see that. And we look to the future and hope that those particular states that were really playing both sides there have learned the lesson that you can't control necessarily the monster that you create, and that in the future, everybody singing off the same sheet of music would be a lot better in terms of achieving mutually held objectives.
Now, Michael Lane, you said those who are playing both sides of this situation. What about the United States? Would you include them in playing both sides? Because on the one hand, as you said, there is a coalition involved in Syria and allegedly fighting against the terrorists, but we also have a lot of proof that the United States actually supported Daesh from the beginning. So tell me your take on that side of things.
Well, I reject that. I don't think the United States provided any direct support to Daesh. There may have been a couple instances where wink, wink, blink, blink took place as some people, my colleague mentioned that, among other things, this was a proxy war, and in many respects it was, and continues to be a proxy war. So there may have been times where discretion being the easiest road to travel, you sort of look the other way, but I really would reject any evidence until I was convinced that the United States provided direct support to them.
All right, what about that Daniel Shaw? Do you think that the United States provided direct support for the terrorists?
Well, I think there's a century plus of evidence of what U.S. foreign policy has been, whether it was in Central America in the 1980s or in the southern cone of Latin America in the 1970s, the border wars in Namibia and in Zimbabwe in the 1980s, on and on, the U.S. has prosecuted this cruel war against the peoples of the world. So I think there's an abundance of evidence. I think Mr. Lane is correct to point out the Frankenstein-like quality of ISIS that really spiraled outside of the control of its handlers, whether it was in Riyadh or Washington, D.C. And now that Daesh has been defeated in Syria and also pushed out by Hezbollah in the small northwestern pocket of Lebanon, we see the Saudis now directing their attention to Lebanon, trying to blame the Iranians for a crisis, for the stepping down of Hariri when it was in fact in Riyadh. So it looks like they're trying to prosecute now this proxy war through Lebanon. They fear Hezbollah and the role that Hezbollah has played in Syria and could potentially play in Yemen, another horrific genocidal war where whether it's a blink, blink, wink, wink, or a direct war through the United States almost makes not much of a difference. It's genocidal towards the 27 million people of Yemen. So we see kind of a shifting of the theaters of war, but not a shifting of the tactics of the U.S. and their primary protectorates, Israel and Saudi Arabia in the region.
Well, Michael Lane, we know that the United States, from the very beginning, supported the overthrow of the Syrian government. And throughout this time, because you said you didn't really have any proof of their support for the terrorists, but throughout this time, they remain very adamant about no matter what, that Assad must go, that they were against the government staying in power, which obviously it meant that they were in the process of supporting those who they thought could overthrow the government. So where's that line between supporting terrorists, not supporting terrorists, supporting democracy? What exactly did the United States do in the country? It seems, basically, it seems like just creating chaos.
Well, as our viewers will remember, back in the Obama administration, there was extensive discussion, and the prevailing opinion was that there were the good rebels, the trustworthy ones, the ones who were after democracy and wanted to depose Assad in order to achieve that. And then, of course, there were the al-Nusra Front and the Daesh and other ones that we knew were terrorists from the very beginning. The good rebels on the ground, of course, made their unholy alliances with the terrorists because they found them very useful in prosecuting their campaign against President Assad. Well, okay, now we fast forward from the Obama administration to the Trump administration. I believe it was last spring when the Trump administration signaled that they were changing policy, that it was no longer a priority for President Assad to step down. It's still an objective that at some time the United States would hope that there would be a more unifying leader of the Syrian people. And in fact, I have my doubts that President Assad is going to be able to peacefully unite the people of Syria, given the track record of the civil war.
But Michael Lane, let me just jump in here. Let me just jump in here.
Chemical weapons.
It is interesting. It is interesting that many would call it perhaps Western arrogance, that from the other side of the world, that the United States feel that it is up to them to decide who should be and should not be in power in any country. But right now we're talking about Syria. And of course you did say about the good terrorists, and it's basically what the United States looked at, because they did know that they were terrorists. They knew that they were cutting people's heads off, and they wink, wink, as you said, look the other way. So what does that mean? When you look the other way, and when these entities, these good terrorists or good rebels are doing that, so what does it mean? Does that not mean support?
Well, it was a slip of the tongue when I used the T word. Please forgive me the use of that. But again, it's not the United States that is imposing its will on the people of Syria. We're willing to let the people of Syria voice their opinion, or at least President Trump has signaled that he's willing to do that. It's just that we have our doubts and expectations that President Assad will be able to provide that unified leadership for the people, given the rather credible allegations of use of chemical weapons against his own people.
All right. Well, let me get Daniel Shaw in. It is very interesting, Daniel Shaw. Your take, I mean, because I'm sure a lot of the people in the world right now would talk about the credibility perhaps of Donald Trump in leading your country, but it doesn't seem like everyone is involved there. So isn't it that we go back to basically this imperialistic arrogance and being able to do whatever they want to do, whenever they want to do it? We go back to General Wesley Clark and what he said about the United States, that they were going to take out 7 countries in 5 years. Isn't that what is it about? That basically entities like the United States, and of course they have their proxies in the region like Saudi Arabia and Israel, but feel like they can do whatever they want to whomever they want at any time that they want.
That is the very imperial agenda that they're prosecuting. I think it's important for an American audience and an international audience to remember that Syria did not have any history of civil war, nor did Iraq, nor did Libya. Certainly in the case of Libya and Iraq, these were very prosperous, really thriving countries. Libya, the richest country in all of Africa, and the standards of living in Iraq, universal health care, and these other benefits. And that's not to say that Saddam Hussein was a good guy, and we could look at what's happening right now in Zimbabwe. And it's not to say that Robert Mugabe or Bashir al-Assad or any of these leaderships are perfect or are socialist or anything like this, but the true bone of contention from the perspective of U.S. intelligence and from the perspective of empire is they're not easily dominated. They're not sufficiently pliant. They're not puppets that the U.S. can get to prosecute the U.S.'s agenda. And it's the same thing in the DPRK in North Korea. So this aggression out of Washington really reflects what countries that they can control and which they can't. So Wesley Clark's statement really reflects this type of logic.
Now, Michael Lane, Syria has landed the U.S.-Saudi-Israeli alliance a major defeat in their support of terrorism in that country and in the region. Tell me, first of all, your perspective about this alliance. This is well, some will say an older alliance, but perhaps it's newer that it's being shown that the United States is working very closely with Saudi Arabia, and of course it has been with Israel, and they all played a very important role in this the stabilization of the situation in the region.
Well, it is an old alliance. I mean, the United States has been allied with both Israel and Saudi Arabia and other countries in that region for, over half a century. And those relationships are positive and they're enduring. What we are looking at now is what will the future of Syria look like, because that might be a microcosm of what the region will look like. Can talks move forward and establish Syria as a peaceful, conflict-free zone where the people live together in harmony, where rebuilding and reconstruction can take place, where the Syrian people and the Syrian economy can become growing and thriving, and they can provide for their own people? Or will conflict continue, and will the risk be such that no one wants to invest in the country, so there will be no rebuilding and there will be no reconstruction and things like that? I think it's very important where the upcoming peace talks are going to lead to, and part and parcel of that is what role will foreign entities play interior to the Syrian process. And I would think that we would be better off in general if ultimately the Syrians had their country to themselves without foreign militaries in them, and if they were able to make their own decisions. But I'm not naive enough to think that that's going to happen right away. So what is the process that will be accepted that will get Syria to that point?
And one wonders, Mr. Lane, Michael Lane, one wonders if you would be saying the same thing if the United States had been victorious in Syria. Now, Daniel Shaw, there are two distinct alliances that have been formed since the terror in Syria. I want to talk about them and the significance. One is the alliance with the Syrian government, Hezbollah, Iran, and Russia. And, of course, the other is United States, Saudi Arabia, and Israel. The significance of both of these alliances.
If it were not for the support of Hezbollah and Iran and Russia of the Syrian Arab army of the Syrian state, ISIS would very likely be in Damascus as we speak. So certainly those have been incredible acts of self-sacrifice and internationalism, almost akin to what the Cubans did in Africa in the 1970s. So we continue to see what some people call a renewed Cold War, or what we can call a global class struggle, where the United States has consistently lined up on the side of pliant regimes where they seek to recolonize these countries. And then we have another pole forming in the wake of 1991 and the fall of the Soviet Union. We have a Russia that's trying to stand up again for itself. We have a Iran which defends its own sovereignty. And though we've seen a Libya fall by the wayside, Syria somehow, some way resisted as evidenced by these latest liberations of towns from ISIS. So this global class war continues to play out in different ways, and we can have no doubt about where the U.S. stands up. And Mr. Lane used a word there that was interesting to me when he said that there was a positive relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia. Certainly from the perspective of empire or the U.S. government and Trump, it might be positive. From the perspective of the U.S. people, hundreds and billions of dollars of arms deals to Saudi Arabia, to Israel for more settlements, for the increased displacement of the Palestinian people, for this genocidal war against Yemen is very negative.
Out of time. I appreciate you being with us. Daniel Shaw, Professor, City University of New York, out of New York City, and also nice to have Mr. Michael Lane, American Institute for Foreign Policy out of Washington, D.C. with us. And as always, viewers, we love having you with us on another debate, and hopefully we'll see you right here, same time, same place tomorrow. Marzia Hashimi, goodbye.